Hello, everybody. Welcome to my Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. If you are subscribers, welcome back. If you're new to the show, glad you're here. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and share it with people. Today, we've got a pretty good show. It is being released, this episode, on June 6, 2024, and we are going to be talking about Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day. Today, we've got Boomer buddies Dan Vikstrom and Quincy Stringham to join in on the dialogue. Hello, Dan. Welcome back to the show.
Rick, hey, how are you doing?
Good to have you here. Quincy, good to have you back as well.
Good, thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's get into it. Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944, 80 years ago. Can you believe that? Dan and Quincy both have an interest in history, as do I. We're going to just have a conversation about D-Day, maybe what we learned in school, people we knew whose dads were in the service, and also relatives that were in the service. And we'll talk about some of the facts as well. So first of all, guys, what in your mind was the causation? What led up to D-Day? I'll start with you, Dan.
Well, the Nazis had kicked the British off of the continent of Europe. The reasoning was to open up another front against the Nazis by invading the beaches of France. The Allies had invaded Italy already, were working up their way up kind of the boot of Italy. This just opened up another theater of conflict on the ground for the Germans. We needed to get going there to get towards an invasion of Germany.
Quincy?
Well, after Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, I believe it was when they broke their non-aggression pact with the Russians, and then the Russians started driving them back from the gates of Moscow and slowly making progress back towards Western Europe. They were pressuring Western allies to do this invasion of France since 1943. But the Western allies felt like they'd fought their way across North Africa, and then they elected to go up, as Dan said, through Italy, and they were not prepared yet in their mind to attack through Northern Europe. So they were getting a lot of pressure from the Russians to move this date up. June 1944 was when it finally came together.
And they had been planning for a while. I'm amazed at how well they kept it a secret, all the deception they had to use to not get to the Germans.
That was amazing. They created under the First Army in England, they created a fake army with tanks and trucks. And just to further deceive the Germans, they put General George Patton as their commander, who was perceived as probably the best American general. And they think, well, they put him in charge, then the Germans will certainly believe this exists because they wouldn't. Patton's in charge of it. So this must be the primary source. And now it's positioned to appear that it would attack through Calais, further north, which is what they were trying to encourage the Germans to believe, since it was only 22 miles across the Channel, as opposed to 140 miles at Normandy. So,
right.
So it's amazing they did that.
And Quincy, you remember the movie Patton, which is one of my favorite all-time war movies. When George C. Scott found out he had to play that role of deception, he had to go meet old ladies at coffees and stuff like that. It was kind of a good scene because he was not the type of guy to be doing that, but that's kind of what they put him to do.
There were two feints they did. One was the southern one, and that tied up 500,000 German soldiers around Calais. Hitler believed that's where it was going. They also did another one, a smaller one up in Norway. They made some noises that looked like they might come in through Norway, and that tied up about 350,000 German troops. And the ones in Calais, they didn't redeploy them south to Normandy till June 26th. So 3 weeks later, huge thing. So it was amazingly successful.
Part of the opening of the attack was kind of a deceptive bombardment of Calais too, like the early in the morning, the night previous of the morning landings. I can't remember who said the first casualty of war is the truth. And of course, you're trying to cover up the truth of what you want to do here, even in the thick of the war. So pretty successful extent.
The global interest at the time, obviously it's called a world war. Hitler's aggression was just getting out of hand. And the United States had to bring their military industrial might into the fold. And Stalin, like you said, Quincy, waited a couple of years to get the West involved. The world knew it was coming, right? And then when it finally happened, I listened to some of the news reporters of the day. I'm trying to compare journalists now to back then, and everything seemed to be positive and rah rah, trying to not cover up the losses, but let them know that our boys were doing their all for the good of the world. So, why do you think, Quincy, this was so important for America to get into this? I know it seems like an obvious question, but what's your perspective on why the U.S. finally came in?
The United States came from ground zero, basically, after Pearl Harbor, and they were still. I mean, my father was in the field artillery, and his first unit, and after he was called up 3 days after Pearl Harbor, because he had an officer's commission that was kind of like was inactive, and his first units were horse-drawn artillery. They ultimately became Sherman tanks, but when he first called, they were still hauling the caissons around with the horses, so they had a long way to go. This is a huge undertaking to invade Europe, and so it took them months and months and months to build up the supplies and the background to support such a massive undertaking. I mean, this was the largest seaborne invasion in world history.
Yeah, 150, I believe, invaded on D-Day, and that included 24,000 airborne troops.
6,800 boats. It's amazing.
But you remember, was it The Longest Day, or what was the movie where they show the airborne assault? That really didn't go off like a charm.
They were landing miles away from their landing zones in marshes, and the gliders were, breaking. I mean, talk about a death wish to ride in on a glider. Can you imagine a wooden glider with tanks on it? And oh my gosh, it's just, there was all sorts of fatalities with that. That's just talk about bravery to do that. Jumping out of a plane with 80 pounds of equipment on your back.
And in the dark, pitch darkness.
In the dark.
There were 130,000 men who crossed the channel with air cover of 20,000 planes.
And total air superiority. And 99% of the planes in the air were Allied planes. The Luftwaffe was essentially a non-factor, which was a huge factor in the success of D-Day as well.
10,500 Allied troops on that day. The Germans lost almost that many.
Yeah, I think that might have been killed and wounded, right? Not all.
Yeah, it was 4,500 were killed.
Yeah.
And that must include the wounded.
It does. Allied casualties. Let's talk about the different beaches. The worst one was Omaha.
Right.
And that was one of the U.S. designated beaches.
The other one was Utah, where we had a lot of men. And the British had Sword and Gold.
Yeah.
Gold, and the Canadians had Juno. There was like a battalion of Free French troops that, I don't know if they were flown in or came in on landing craft, but they had a responsibility to attack. So I can't remember what town it was. Even some Norwegians, but of course the heavy lifting was done by the Americans and the British as far as numbers and everything.
The invasion started shortly after midnight, the morning of June 6th, with extensive aerial and naval bombardment, as well as airborne assault, like we talked about. 24,000 American, British, and Canadian airborne troops. Wow. The early morning assault was soon followed by Allied amphibious landings on the coast of France at about 6:30 a.m. The target 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast was divided into the beaches we just talked about: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. And there were strong winds that blew a lot of the craft off course and the parachutes off course.
Also, the 2nd Ranger Battalion attacked Pont du Hoc, which is a high point, because there was enemy artillery there, which they thought would be, they wanted to knock it out because they had great views of the landing beaches. Mm-hmm. So that Ranger Battalion scaled like an over 100-foot cliff or set of cliffs to get to the top of that, eventually take out those placements. That's one memory I have. Probably the best commemoration speech of D-Day was that I've ever heard was Reagan's 40th in 1984. He talks about, these are the boys of Pont du Hoc. These are the men who scaled the cliffs. And all the veterans are sitting behind them. And they were in their 60s by then. So they were our age, or even some of them probably younger. Some of them probably definitely younger at that point in their lives. Just a really emotional moment for them. And great speech by Reagan.
One of the interesting things about that shows the craziness of war, and you can't plans don't go as planned. When they in fact got up to the top of that Point de Hoc, the huge railroad car and artillery pieces that were supposed to be there weren't there. They'd moved them inland, so they got up there and said they're not here. There were still German troops up there, and there's a great scene from the Band of Brothers miniseries on HBO that depicts that attack. It's pretty graphic. It's very, very well done. Imagine grappling up the ropes and they're shooting down at you. And,
I know. How he can pull up the courage and guts to do that, I don't know. I guess it's because you're side by side with your buddies and you don't want to let them down.
Yeah, it's just a thing that subsequent generations have not experienced, really. I mean, the closest we've come to it is the post 9/11 eras, where the country all pulled together. But everybody was in on this. All walks of life, all economic levels, they're all found a way to contribute. They knew they were doing the right thing and it had to be done. And there was this feeling of we have to basically save the world, and they were right. Then they were right. That's why they called them the greatest generation. Some of the acts of heroism is just amazing what these guys went through. I think about these guys. Every time I see one of these shows, and they're approaching the beach in the Higgins boat with the flap that drops down, and immediately they're raked with machine gun fire. I'm thinking, try and put yourself in that position. Think about going that, and then and you've got 80 pounds of equipment on your back, and you've got to jump into water. You don't know if the water's a foot deep or 8 feet deep, which some of them were. And some of these guys drowned right on the spot. They had so much equipment, they swam to the bottom. Right. Or they got shot with machine gun. It's just amazing, just unbelievable, the bravery to do this,
Another reason, Rick, to think about is the Allies wanted to get the war over with as soon as possible, because you had a civilian population that had to support this war. And if losses got too high and things dragged out too long, the American population was going to start going, hey, we're tired of this. I'm not talking about the soldiers, but the civilian population on the home front. That's the reason why in the Pacific, for instance, they went so fast from one campaign to another. They didn't want to have war fatigue overtake the support of the war effort at home.
Getting back to the beaches and how terrifying that must have been, you see a Higgins boat next to you that a shell hits it directly, and a lot of the officers and friends are gone. So the leadership is scattered. You get on the beach, and watching documentaries where the veterans talked about their experiences there, almost all of them said they were scared, but the training kicked in. They had to find a way to survive, and they had to find a way to get the mission done. And they wanted to help their buddies. They're fighting for their buddies too. But what they saw, they can't unsee. I had an uncle who landed on Utah Beach, the second wave. And then consequently, he went through everything. He was with Patton's army. He was in the 94th Infantry, the 3rd Army. He experienced the second wave of Utah Beach, part of the Battle of the Bulge, liberated a concentration camp, helped smash the Siegfried Line. And he's a guy that thankfully my cousin picked his dad's brain, and he did talk about a lot of things, but there's some things he didn't like to talk about.
My father was also with Patton in the 3rd Army. He was in the 11th Armored Division. Mm-hmm. And they went ashore in the fall from England. Went through the Battle of the Bulge, crossed into Germany, liberated Mauthausen concentration camp, ended the war around Linz, Austria. So he got the full tour of Europe as well. And he would talk about it if I brought it up. If I brought it up. He never volunteered. He didn't tell war stories, but he would talk about it. And as I got older and I got interested in it, and I had the unbelievable opportunity in 1966 to go over with him and retrace his steps.
Really?
Yeah. And we saw where he crossed the Rhine. We found a farmhouse that they bivouacked in outside of Bastogne. He was in Bastogne. They was one of the units that went and relieved the 101st. Yeah. He walked down the driveway. I'm so embarrassed. As a typical teenager. The Belgian farmer came out, and there was a lot of arm movement around, and pretty soon they're hugging. And they invited us in, and we had dinner around the table. Nobody nobody spoke the same language, but we had dinner with the family, and they were so gracious. And yeah, and then he was over there for a whole year after the war ended in military government, getting all the people sorted out. So he has some very strong opinions about about the Nazis
Sure.
and the concentration camp experience.
My uncle was a staff sergeant and he captured an officer. The officer was just arrogant. He got his Luger and he also got a motorcycle. Sounds like they're in the same Third Army, huh? 94th Infantry, Third Army. Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Cool. So let me ask you guys this. The airborne, they had to control the crossroads so the reinforcements couldn't get in. So they had a big job. The Rangers had to go up the sheer cliffs and everybody else came in. The engineers had to blow up the mines and everything on the beach that was blocking. That General Rommel prepared all that seaboard fortification. That was a big job. And the cost for these guys, these young men, was terrible, but I mean, they changed the world. 11 weeks later, they liberated Paris.
At the end of August, there's over 2 million troops had crossed and had gone into Europe. And just the sheer size of it all is really amazing. And one thing I wanted to mention is that at the same time, on the other side of the world, the Americans were going to conduct an operation which kicked off 9 days after D-Day in the Marianas Islands, the invasion of Saipan, the first. And that, if you think about it, compare the two, it's pretty astounding because that was a huge force of 70,000 fighting soldiers, over 500 ships, including 15 carriers, and battleships, of course, and cruisers. But they picked up and hauled all that stuff. You think about the English Channel being 20 miles wide and crossing that. They went 3,200 miles with almost 600 ships, 500,000 sailors, the invasion force. And just like I said, they wanted to move quickly to try to end the war sooner rather than later. And it just goes to show what a behemoth industrially the United States was then. That we could not do that now, build that many ships. I read China's largest shipyard has 50 times the shipbuilding capacity of all our shipyards combined. They're kind of vis-a-vis the way we were against Japan, the industrial behemoth. China had industrial capacity now. If it ever came to blows between our two nations, hopefully it won't. The capacity of the industrial might of the United States was unsurpassed, and it was the largest naval force ever, and it won't be matched by any nation probably ever again, the way warfare has progressed and everything.
So great feats on two different fronts. Coming across the English Channel, that's still a big feat as well with all the vessels. Other parts of the war that we can talk about in other episodes, but I'm going to ask you guys, in your minds, how important was D-Day?
Well, let me tell you, I've read this not that long ago, and I looked it up today just to make sure I had it right. If D-Day had failed, and we were driven back into the ocean and back to Britain, there was no plan B. This had to succeed, okay? If this had not succeeded, there would not have been any Western Allied, wouldn't have been British and American troops heading east towards Berlin. And if we had retreated from there, those German troops guarding the Western Front would have been able to move eastward and fight against the Russians as well. They would have been able to redeploy them to the east. But Russia would have been able to, assuming they were able to keep progressing from east to west, they could have ended up on the English Channel.
Oh yeah,
and all of Western Europe would have been communist bloc after World War II. It was huge global ramifications into the Cold War era and our lifetimes that were affected by this 24-hour period of not being driven back into the sea. And there were any number of fortuitous and even lucky situations that helped to bring success. Rommel went to Germany because it was his wife's birthday.
Yes.
And the weather was supposed to be lousy, and they didn't think that they would be able to invade during this period of time. The German weather stations, this is what it showed. But the Allies had weather stations on the west coast of Ireland, further west, that showed, in fact, that this window was coming. So the Allies saw this window. The Germans didn't see this window.
Hmm.
And so Rommel goes east. The morning of the invasion, they were afraid to wake up Hitler. That classic blunder, because they were scared of his reaction. So he slept till mid-morning. Meanwhile, this is taking place, and they needed his authority to release all the Panzer divisions that were sitting in reserve miles and miles and miles away, and they just sat there during the invasion. And even after he woke up, he wouldn't release them because he was determined that this was just a feint, and it was kind of going through Calais, as we discussed earlier. There was some, things that real blunders and just strokes of good luck for the Allies that really contributed to the success. It had generational ramifications.
Yep. Geopolitically, it did just that day, for sure.
Do you realize that a lot of schools don't even teach about D-Day?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, well, all you have to do is, that's fairly obvious in current events that they don't teach.
It's sad, and I don't like to usually go there, but this is too big a deal, what happened 80 years ago. What they're teaching, if they do teach anything, they teach that Nazi Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and sometimes they don't even teach that. World War II ended in 1945. They might teach that. And then this guy who made these statements, he goes, now open your textbook to chapter 17 and let's talk about the moon landing. I mean, moon landing was great. This was world changing. Quincy, you just said it changed the entire geopolitical spectrum of the world.
We started fighting the Cold War during World War II. They were positioning. I mean, the Russians, they had a much larger viewpoint than the Allies did. The Western Allies did. I mean, they kind of played the Western Allies. My dad told me that they were coming across Germany and into Austria, and they made them stop. They just sat there and waited,
Let's go get the Russians now.
Yeah. And then they hooked up with the Russians, and he didn't come away with a real positive impression of the Russians from his interactions with them at the end of the war.
We had a nice discussion and maybe a mini tribute to all those brave men and women who sacrificed to basically save the world. D-Day, 80 years ago today, June 6th. Guys, do you have any closing comments you want to make?
Something we should all remember. It was a really very, very important thing.
Yeah, I agree.
We hear a lot about the greatest generation, the Tom Brokaw book and that phrase. It's so true. I believe those men and women are rightfully proud of their accomplishments, and they were right.
Yes.
They have every right to be proud of what they did. And those of us, the baby boomers that follow along behind, we owe them a lot. We
Absolutely.
owe them.
And that is a constant theme in many of the My Boomer Buddies episodes, thanking the greatest generation for giving us the life that we were afforded to have great things, wonderful things. And it could have been a different story if we did not have Operation Overlord and the sacrifices.
These guys, these men and women, they knew what they were fighting for. They knew it was worth fighting for and perhaps dying for. And they just went and did it.
Nowadays, they need to learn about what happened and try to understand. We don't want to have history erased more than it already is. We need to learn history or we will be doomed to repeat it. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you. Watchers and listeners out there, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe the episodes on YouTube. And also you can hear us on Buzzsprout and Spotify. These guys, Dan Vikstrom, Quincy Stringham, they're regulars on here. They're Boomer Buddies. They bring us a lot of great content. And I just truly want to thank you two for being part of this.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Rick.
For My Boomer Buddies podcast, I'm Rick Reed. And until next time, we'll see you around the block.
If you enjoy this podcast and are viewing on YouTube, please like. Hit the subscribe button on your screen and share it with your friends, and feel free to comment below. You can also hear us on Spotify and Buzzsprout. Feel free to email comments too. myboomerbuddies4@gmail.com.